Hello, hello, hello. All right. This is the very first lecture of the Jeffersonian America series. Um, Time frame is 1800 until. All right. For sure and easily, it's all the way up until Jacksonian America, which is the other time frame that is named for a person. In American history, there are only two time frames that are named for people. One is for Jefferson, the other is Jackson. So you can kind of get a feel for how important this one is, and the one right after this one is going into Jacksonian. And these are the main two time frames that we will be talking about for test 2, Jeffersonian America and Jacksonian America. All right. So, what we're going to cover, it's pretty easy. Today, we're going to focus on several things, but the only two key points you need to take notes on for the test are Noah Webster and the Second Great Awakening. All right. So, with that being said, let's start Jeffersonian America. All right. How I like to start this series off is with a social portrait. What I mean by a social portrait is give you an idea of how the average American lived during this time. All right. So, what we're going to do is look at, and well, I'll tell you stories. I'll give you little vignettes into what it was like to be an American during the early 1800s. All right. First, let's talk about housing. All right. One, of course, you have the plantation homes, which most people think of since we're living here in the South. These large white houses on the hills with the columns that the slave owners had. Those are, of course, a major, really, kind of a horrible icon of the 1800s. We also have the mansions of the cities, which aren't any better. It's the filthy rich in New York, Boston, and elsewhere that have these large mansions where they take advantage of slave labor and just complete advantage of paid labor as well, both of them. And then you have the city housing, like in Boston or Philadelphia or New York, where you have large groups of people living. The best place during this time to kind of give an encapsulation of it is in Philly. Lots of wood structures, 2 or 3 stories high. Most of them have brothels, pubs, and dwellings all in the same areas. Philadelphia has like more than 3 times as many bars as it does churches during this time. And these pubs, taverns, all of these places have everything and most things a working man wants to get. So we have these kind of things, right? We have the plantations. We have in the South. We have the mansions in the North. We have the city housing that is work, entertainment, and living for the average people. And then we have what is considered, and really is, the quintessential American home of the 1800s. And that, of course, is the log cabin. I'm sure. Well, I don't even know. You guys are so much younger than me. I grew up with Lincoln logs. You know, the little red things that you'd build these little cabins and build houses with and fences with. I don't even know if they sell that anymore. I know that I bought them for my oldest daughter, and my youngest daughter played with them. But I'm not sure if that was because I'm an old fogey and a historian, or if that's still what happens, right? But the log cabin, everybody knows, and everybody has an idea of what a log cabin is, right? Of course, this is made from the wood in the surrounding area. It is a one-room house. Usually, for the most part, it was about 14 by 10 or bigger, but it was just one. And you'd have a fire pit in the middle, a hole in the center of the roof where the smoke could escape. You would have, in different areas on the walls, what would be considered nowadays windows, but these would be not glass, but wood flaps that would be put over these areas. And the door was wood, and the wood door would be attached with leather hinges, and really the only metal at all in these log cabins would be what would attach the hinges of the door and the windows sometimes to the frame of the house. All right, the leather hinges on the door where you would enter into these log cabins would be nailed in with these iron nails. And what you'd have is a hole that would run up through the top and down if you wanted someone to pull it and lift the latch to the door so the door would open so you could enter. That was sometimes. Most of the time when you're inside and the door was latched, it was because you're protecting yourself and you didn't want anybody in. All right. So you have the log cabin, which was the standard for the large portion of Americans during the early 1800s, all the way through the end of the 1800s, post-Civil War on. All right. For 100 years, this is one of the mainstays, main ways of life and living for the Americans. Some of the ones that had done well for themselves would attach what they'd call a dog trot, or a little overhang that would go between the cabin and an extra little area, which sometimes is a kitchen, a storage area, or a place to keep horses or something else, livestock, in the cold. All right. So you'd have the plantations, you'd have the mansions, you'd have the city housing, and you'd have the log cabins of the average white Americans. Remember, we talked about in colonial America what it was like for the African American, the African American slave of the time. It could have ranged from anything from a hole in the ground to a lean-to log cabins. So that's the housing of the time frame. Also, cooking. What most people ate on a daily basis tended to be pork and corn. All right, corn and pork were the daily diet of most Americans throughout the 1800s, and of course the eggs, things like that. But corn and pork and eggs, the big thing. Secondary meats like deer, buffalo, squirrel, turkey, fish, anything like that is up to how well the people hunted. All right. Veggies and fruits, of course. You have the corn, which is the mainstay, but you also have potatoes, beans, carrots, blackberries, grapes, mayhaws, blueberries here in the South. A lot of other things that would be grown in gardens and would grow wild. But those would be things that you would grow and gather. So those are all secondary things. But those were the main foods. You could pretty much guarantee pork and corn and other veggies were daily. All right. During this time, education was important, but we did not have organized schools because we didn't have the money or the people to populate them. We didn't have the organized education system yet, right? So, most of the time in the town, it tended to be the preacher that taught people how to read out of the Bible and would teach them how to do very basic math out of the scripture as well. And this would be very, very seasonal. When the farmers were having downtimes, this would be when it was. But during heavy work times, you didn't have any education. But you do get this infrequent education at the beginning that would allow for quite a few, a large number of white Americans to learn how to read, which was uncommon in Western Europe, but common here. Like I said, they would learn, for the most part, out of the Bible, but at the same time, another very important work would be the almanac. All right, the almanac was huge. The Farmer's Almanac had all kinds of them. Of course, the most popular during colonial times and up and through this time, Ben Franklin. So these farmers' almanacs would be a very important things that would help farmers. So farmers wanted to learn to read so they could understand what was going on, when to plant, when to do different things. So we had the Bible and the almanac in the beginning that would make the basic lesson plan. All right. Later on, when we'll talk about another guy that will give us the dictionary, the blueback speller, and something else. All right. But we'll get to him here in a minute. Another thing, law and order. We didn't have police. We didn't have organized, we didn't have an organized law and order at this time. People took care of themselves. Somebody murdered, it tended to be you murdered back. It was frontier justice. All right. For the most part, communities worked very closely with one another, these farming communities. And if there was a family or an individual in these farming communities that didn't do their job or was a problem in these communities, they would be warned, they would be fined, they would be penalized in some way. And if they kept doing these things that hurt the community, they would be punished. All right. If it was an individual or a family that were thieves, they would be told not to do it. If they kept doing it, they would be told to leave. If they didn't leave, you could get different kinds of punishment. Sometimes it'd be slicing the nose. Sometimes they'd drill a hole through the tongue. Sometimes, in wherever the organized town for the farming community was, they'd nail an ear to the courthouse door. so people could go in and out, opening and closing the door, and whoever was nailed to the door had to keep up with it or get the nail ripped out of their ear and had to be nailed back to the door. It was a game. So they were shamed for the most part and punished physically. If these people kept going, they would be ostracized. They'd be told to leave. If they wouldn't leave, it would be what? It would end up, after all these punishments, like if the tongue didn't work, or an ear or nose, or, the punishments didn't work, it would go to what my great-grandfather used to say: he needed killing. And that's what would happen. They would kill these people, dig a hole outside of town, dump them in it, bury them up. Pure and simple. Justice by the town. If you couldn't be a part of the community, you were a detriment to the community eliminated you, either through punishment, being ostracized, or killing. Right? So you've got that. Going on with the social portrait, the kids did get to play. Nowadays, we think of childhood, we think of things basically all the way up to adolescence and through 18. But back then, childhood ended once you had enough hand-eye coordination and dexterity to work with a dad. So, somewhere around 7 to 10 years old, according to how strong you were, is when you became an adult. Remember, kids were getting married and paired off in their teens. For the kids, though, the young ones, when they were young and helped mom around the garden with the livestock and around the house, they were given time to play. Tag, right? Everybody knows tag. Leapfrog, kites, marbles, hopscotch, tops, spinning tops, hide and go seek, and role play. Back then they tended to role play, famous revolutionaries in the time frame we are in the early 1800s, and frontiersmen that went out and explored the wilderness, like the Cumberland Gap and everything else. But you do have a small childhood. You got to remember, a lot of these kids, their parents would start dying when they were, the older ones in the family, their parents would start dying when they were 9, 10, 11, 12, in a lot of cases, which is very common in the 1800s, 1700s, and before. So now you've got a kind of a brief look. You got a little social vignette, a little social portrait of the past. All right. Also, another huge thing that I wish it's deep inside my heart that I wish we'd go back to, is this idea of cultural nationalism. This idea of being, what it means to be American is to strive to be better, to create a better world. This idea of, it's not patriotism, it's not nationalism, it is something that is completely American, and it's cultural nationalism. This idea that we can and should and have to make a better world for ourselves and for our children and the future generations. And how do you make a better world? So this is what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. How to make a better world. This idea of cultural nationalism. This is the first thing that actually truly unites Americans into a people, into a citizen. This idea of being an American. It doesn't come from a country that is the richest, the most powerful, or anything else. It comes from the grassroots up. It comes from the idea that what makes America great is the people. Huge, huge importance. I wish we could get back to that. So, first thing we need to talk about in this focus on cultural nationalism is what's usually referred to as the Republican vision. In other words, what Jefferson saw as what would make America the best. Right? First and foremost, the key to this is education. The better educated the people, the better the country. You need education to be able to function. You have to have education to function in a democracy. You need people that can have and do have critical thinking, that can be given evidence, bullshit, and everything else, go through it, research it, think about it, and come to a logical, factual end. All right? So education is of the utmost importance in American history, and we have lost this. The last real push for education in America was in the 1960s under Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. Right? We have moved away from this. And every generation has suffered for it ever since. In my opinion, education in the democratic sense to help promote and make a better world, you need a better educated populace. Every generation should be better educated than the last. And that hasn't happened. Really hasn't happened. My generation, Gen X, was the last to get a decent education. The last to get a good education was my parents' generation, the baby boomers. And that's horrific. And look at what's happened since the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, teens, where we are now. It's a horrific progression when we do not have a good education system. Also, another thing that is important, that is always been at the core of cultural nationalism, at the core of what it means to be an American, is the idea of the self-made man. Right? Self-made man. You know, in the old days, how I grew up hearing it, it's where you put your nose to the grindstone. You work hard. The harder you work, the more you work, the more likely you are to have success. You have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, to steal another, just still another colloquialism. All of these things, this idea of the self-made man, is the idea that anyone in America, if they work hard enough, can be successful. Right? And this is a core belief that has been since Jeffersonian America, and was during this Jeffersonian America started with this idea of cultural nationalism. Back then, of course, this idea of the self-made man was the idea that what you need is to go out, get your own land, grow your own food, hunt your own land, do your own thing, be the king of your castle, right? Create your own world, an agricultural world. But this idea of the self-made man, the educated self-made man, is the center, is the core of this idea of cultural nationalism that makes, well, that should make, and has made, and could make America amazing. All right. Also, another big thing is, with all this stuff, is scientific advancement. Now, during this time, we have Robert Fulton in the steamboat. We'll talk about him later. We also have Oliver Evans. He's the one that creates the first steam engine here in America. He creates the first car, basically. He gets a carriage, turns it in, puts a steam engine on it, turns it into basically a 2-cylinder steam engine car. So science and technology from the outset, right here at the beginning, is always going, always advancing, just exponentially changing America from generation to generation. And this is part of that education as well. Another thing is literature. During the early 1800s, with literature, it was a hodgepodge, a mix, right? In early American literature, you have people like Washington Irving. You've probably heard of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, things like that. Irving and a lot of the original American writers in the early 1800s took old European folktales, horror stories, just basically old European stories, and twisted them around, mixed them up, and made them American, right? Instead of Sleepy Hollow being set in Europe, it was set in New England. Instead of having, European protagonist, it had an American. So early American lit tended to be kind of a rip-off of older European fiction, right? This is going to quickly change, all right? We're going to talk about this a lot, and this is going to rapidly change. The American arts in the 1800s grew rapidly, quickly, and become some of the most brilliant in the Western world. Also, during this time, really, the most important during the early 1800s, or what we would really usually think of as biographies nowadays, or autobiographies, right? And one of the key figures that kind of kicks all this off, hope you guys enjoy this paused image, but one of the guys that kicks all of this off is Michel Jean de Crévecoeur, all right? Crévecoeur. This is a Frenchman that moves over here, settles in. Sorry, I keep cracking up with the image that's frozen on the screen. Crévecoeur, with Modern Chivalry, Letters from an American Farmer. These are autobiographical things that take us into and give us a glimpse of what it was like to be an American, to come over from a foreign country, settle in to this new world, become an American citizen, and completely make your own world, right? Cultural nationalism. So we have, with Modern Chivalry, Letters from an American Farmer, and a lot of other autobiographies of this time, these glimpses into the past, right? These glimpses into this time where we see how people became and how we became American. All right? And this finally gets us to our first key point of the lecture. All right? And this first key point is Noah Webster. All right? Noah Webster is one of the most important intellectuals and men of letters of American history. I'm sure you've heard of Webster's Dictionary, and this was one of his creations. He would spend most of his life in the late 1700s and early 1800s pulling together French, Spanish, American, Native American, African, African American, all kinds of words, all kinds of dialects, all kinds of these things, pulling them together, defining them, and putting them in what would become the first American dictionary, Webster's Dictionary. Numerous versions of this would come out through the 1800s, and he would keep adding to it more and more and more until his death. All right. So this is one of his major works. All right. And this is of utmost importance. This is a huge thing in cultural nationalism. Why? This is establishing American English. But not only does he do this with the dictionary, he also does it with what's known as the American Spelling Book. It's also known as the Elementary Spelling Book. It's also known as the Blue-Backed Speller. This is something that would come out in the early 1800s and would continue to come out throughout the 1800s. I have a copy of this that belonged to my great-grandmother. Well, it was my great-grandmother that gave it to me, but her grandmother gave it to her, and the grandmother before her. It's from the mid to early 1800s. This is an old book that has been passed down in my family since the 1800s. And this is how a lot of Americans, a majority of Americans in the 1800s, would become educated. This was the original English book. This is where most people outside of the Bible, the Almanac, would learn how to read. This would be one of our very first textbooks that would emerge in the early 1800s and continue on all the way to the early 20th century. So we have Webster, just a huge intellectual figure that basically gives America its own words and sentence structure, grammar. It is why there's such a huge difference between American English and British English, and in the academic fields and in how people talk. So we have our first big key point of this lecture. I know it took a while to get to it, but I wanted to kind of give you guys, like I said, a social portrait. The last thing that we're going to talk about in this lecture, and this one in particular, is the Second Great Awakening. This is the other key point for the day, well, for the lecture. And this is where the idea that a lot of modern people have that America is a Christian nation kind of comes from. All right? This is, of course, decades and decades after the founding of America. All right. The founders, like we talked about, they focused and really created America on a utopian Enlightenment feel. This second Great Awakening that would happen in the 1800s would be where Christianity really becomes an integral part of the American psyche and the American way of life. All right. So, let's talk about this, and that's what we're going to end with this lecture. The Second Great Awakening. First thing to really think about with this, and the first thing that's very important to know with this, the first thing is that 2 out of every 3 converts to this new American Christianity, this new Great Awakening version of Christianity, were women. All right. This is of huge importance, not immediately, but through time. All right. And this would continue through time. As this Great Awakening would spread, this stayed true. 2 out of every 3 converts tended to be female. So what this means and why this is so important is because throughout the 1800s, as this Great Awakening, as this revival continued, more and more and more and more large numbers of women were converted to Christianity. And you got to remember, this is important because who is the teacher of the kids? Who raises the kids during the 1800s? Who are the ones in the end of the 1800s during the schoolhouses teaching? It's women. Women are the nurturers and pretty much the main nurturers of children in the 1800s. So what this means is that the children of the early, mid, late mid, and ending of the 1800s during this Great Awakening, all of them are exposed to this new form of Christianity by their mothers. It's kind of funny because when you think about it, you don't trust your parents for many things. You have your own clothes style, you listen to your own music, but have you ever noticed how your belief system is kind of shaped by them, whether you like it or not? Politically, you're either what they are or against it. But religion-wise, how you were raised religiously tends to seep in to the very core of a person. And more often than not, you share that from birth to death with your parents. So this Great Awakening, with this conversion rate of 2 out of every 3 early converts, and converts in general being women, plays a real role in shaping the future of America in the 1800s, converting to this idea of Christianity. All right. Also, it's like we talked about with the first time when we talked about the first Great Awakening, this idea of a personal relationship with God. Very important. It's no longer focused in an intense study. You no longer need a Catholic priest or a Puritan minister. You don't need a highly schooled individual to teach you how to get to heaven. what you need and what you get in this awakening with this Protestant revival is a personal connection to Jesus and God. All right? So you have this individualistic religion. But at the same time, it's very communal, because this is spreading through the north, through the Midwest, all the way down through the south. It's spreading throughout America during the 1800s. And the three main denominations, remember, it's Protestantism. They're Protestant, so it's Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterians. The three key denominations in all of this. And it's still, to this day, they are still the three major forms of Protestantism in America. Most of the other churches you see are spin-offs of these. All right. Also, this is a very emotional and enthusiastic religion. For the white Americans, what we're focusing on right at this moment, it is one of these things where it is a real focus on guilt and a connection to God to get rid of that guilt. For white Americans, it tends to come, and this comes from Europe, it comes from the Anglican faith in England and Catholicism, this idea of original sin. All right. With the African Americans that get converted, it is not a mourning of faith or trying to get rid of original sin, that hopefully God will lift you out of it. But with the African American faith, we'll talk about it throughout the semester, during the 1800s, it tends to be a celebration of faith, that this world is where you're oppressed and held down. But the thereafter is hopeful and limitless. And this comes from the Second Great Awakening. Also, as the 1800s move along, the church just completely meshes and collides and can't get separated from the idea of being American. The Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, this Protestant American religion, it becomes hardcore American. So what you'll see is from the pulpit, preachers are preaching basically American propaganda. I mean, these people are talking about the greatness of Washington, how he was a good Christian, how he's a perfect American, how we should model ourselves after that. I mean, to many of these, he becomes the American Jesus Christ, a civic religion like we've been talking about. But these churches, it becomes an important part of Americana. They push the American way. They push this idea of what it means to be an American, how to be an American, what you had to do to be an American. It's intriguing, right? Especially since they had nothing to do with it. But they come in and become a part of it. Also, kind of get into and wrap it up with how it affects things regional. Sorry, need some water. All right. In the north, we talked about declension last time and how it helped move away from Puritanism and old school hardcore Congregationalism, Puritanism, Quakerism, all the old really hardcore faiths. Declension kind of moved them to modernity with this moving away from a theological way of life to a more mercantile way of life. And the Second Great Awakening would play an even bigger role in that. This would basically be the democratization of Christianity in the North. Puritans, Quakers, Congregationalists would become less and less important, and the big three Protestants denominations would become more and more relevant, and this modern Protestant Christianity would come into being. And to wrap it up, let's talk about the South. All right. In the South, it's very different. Just like we've been talking about, there is always a huge distinction in early American history between Northerners and Southerners. And no different with religion. Remember, in colonial America, it tended to be a lot of men, indentured servants and otherwise, that partied, worked, did their own thing, created their own world, and the afterlife and spirituality played hardly any role in it. All right. But with the Second Great Awakening, that changes for Southern culture. This is where you can kind of start to see the beginning of what we would now know as the Bible Belt, right? The Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists would become an integral part of Southern culture. Also, during this time, slave owners would convert, in their minds, all of their slaves. So during this Second Great Awakening in the 1800s, slave owners exposed their African American, which they were by this point in the 1800s, African American slaves to Christianity. And on Sundays, they would bring in preachers to preach to the slaves. All right. So the idea was to convert all of the slaves to this American Christianity. And with this Great Awakening and this conversion of the African Americans to Christianity, a lot of it centered around and focused on, telling them to obey their masters, focusing in on creating good servants. All right. This is not saying that in the 1800s the African Americans didn't have their own version of Christianity, which we're going to talk about more and more, and that they had their own religions and versions that we'll talk about. But what white America exposed the African American slave to was a Christianity that was meant to promote them as obeying their master and doing what they were told to do. All right. So we have this Second Great Awakening. We have Noah Webster. And I've given you guys and gals kind of a social portrait of the early 1800s. And this portrait that I gave you guys and gals just moves on through. I mean, this is how the majority of white Americans lived throughout the 1800s. And with these key points, especially with the Second Great Awakening, I kind of give you a little glimpse into the African American. But like I said, throughout the semester at different sections with Reform, with the Old South, with other things, we're going to really dig into and talk a lot more about African American. So, with that, this is the first Jeffersonian lecture, and the next is soon to follow. See you guys next time.